welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining. Who here, just a brief show of hands, has been to a Foresight event before? Okay, then I rely on you to take the others a bit by the hand. Good morning, Matthias. Welcome. Yeah, wherever. You are taking the front row. I like it. Just a reminder that you, by now, hopefully you have filled out the little intro doc. So if you have forgotten anything that anyone previously mentioned in their introductions, that's all in the Google Doc now. And a short link to that is bit.ly/AI intros. So if you ever need that link, there's a short link for that. And if you have not sent me your slide presentations, you can do so by dropping them in the bit.ly/AI presentations folder now. That would be wonderful. Okay, well, I'll do like a brief intro to Foresight, just to get those people that may not know very much about us up to speed, and then say a few more words about like what we're going to do at the workshop, and give a few examples of like things that I think are interesting, or for me like mark examples of this space. And so Foresight has existed since 1986. So really quite some time, before my time, actually. And we were founded on a book called Engines of Creation. We were founded by Eric Drexler and Christine Peterson. And Engines of Creation laid out this very ambitious future marked by a variety of different technologies with a big focus on AI and molecular nanotechnology. And over the years, we've kind of like really split that up into individual buckets of areas that we focus on. Intelligent cooperation is what we call this kind of like security and cryptography enabled approach to AI, which is the kind of bucket that you're in right now. We also do a lot of work on molecular machines and molecular nanotechnology, neurotechnology. We just had a workshop on whole brain emulations for AI safety, and longevity biotechnology, space, and existential hope is kind of our word for like, let's aim for positive futures rather than just like general technological progress undirectedly. And we do, like, we support these areas through a variety of different ways. Like, we have seminars. Who here is in our seminar group for intelligent cooperation, or maybe has even given a presentation in there? And so we have these virtual presentations in each of these areas that run once per month in each of these technological fields. We also have prizes and fellowships. And so we have for each of our technical areas a prize. And I'll say a little bit more about a new one that we're starting in this field in a second. And we have a fellowship as well in these areas, and many of our fellows are here. Thanks a lot for coming, guys. You definitely make all of this very worth it. But I think really where the bulk of our work happens is at our technical workshops. And so in each of these domains, we do workshops, and you're at one of them right now. And this is really kind of like kicked off by the fact that, like, I think, you know, more of the type of collaboration that we try to encourage, which is more interdisciplinary and perhaps a bit more ambitious than the, like, yeah, I guess the normal bits that you're allowed to discuss in academia. They, I think, don't really have a home often, and so we try to give them a home in these annual workshops. And so we used to, in the AI category at least, we used to do, like, I guess 6 years ago, or 7 years ago, we started doing workshops that were mostly focused on timeframes and policy for AI. That was one, they used to be after EAG in San Francisco, then one on AGI coordination and great powers, which was a lot of like US-China dynamics, one on generally like toward cooperation, so how can even like individual actors in the space, including companies, cooperate better. And then, you know, there was this entire governance space, an AI governance space that was really kicked off at that time. And, you know, so we really focused a little bit more on the security aspects recently. And so we had one workshop last year, and if you're interested to get a little bit of a sense of like what could be, you know, potential outcomes here, there's a lot of like the presentations are now online at that workshop page. And it was, yeah, it was pretty good. We're just trying to explore a little bit more that kind of emerging space between cryptography, security, and AI as something to focus on more. So I welcome you to check this out. It's been a ton of fun. And we have a really interesting few projects that came out of that are also going to be presenting here. So it's kind of our second follow-up on this workshop. And some of you were there last year, but I think there's been so much happening in AI and these other areas too that we're hoping to do like a really wonderful follow-up this time. And so that's the workshop that you're currently at, which is really like trying to kind of like focus in a little bit more deeply at that intersection between cryptography, security, and AI, because I mean, each of these fields is very big, pretty complex, pretty technical, but I think there's actually a lot to get at that intersection that is not usually encouraged in other settings. And so we're really trying to dig down a little bit more into that. Now, what do I mean by that? And so I think to discuss like just a few potential areas that we could be focusing on. First of all, like, why are we doing this stuff? And so I think probably many of you know Metaculus. I'm assuming we have Dan even here. And so this is still from March 28. So it's a little bit, I guess, like, sorry, it's this one. Actually, I think I pulled on a few days ago or something. But the community prediction for the arrival of artificial general intelligence was, I think, September 27, 2032. And I think a year ago, it was still 10 years later than that. So it was about a 10-year drop. Is that roughly correct? Yep. Yes. So a 10-year drop in the arrival for AGI within the span of about a year. And so that's pretty crazy. And so I think, it really warrants kind of like a new push. And I think many of you are actively working on this, really. But I think that we've seen like a few really interesting developments. We've seen like a lot of consolidation of like really main actors in this space. Microsoft teaming up with OpenAI, Google Cloud or Google teaming up with Anthropic, and Google Brain and like DeepMind really like merging a lot more. We've also seen, I think, some sparks of generalization. There was this paper that's probably also already outdated because it's now been like, I think, a few months since it was published. But it basically really like tried to pinpoint that there's a few ways in which these systems maybe even already show like some theory of mind that is relatively advanced. And then we have also a lot of like recent push for agency. And so, Audit GPT and Baby GPT are like at least like early versions of systems that can outsource different tasks to each other to become perhaps more agentic. And so I think that and many other developments led Eliezer Yudkowsky to go on a Bankless podcast. Who here has seen that podcast? It was pretty wild. And it was, I think, surprising for two reasons. The first reason was that he was, I guess that was not that surprising. He was very, very pessimistic that we can do very much about AI safety, or that we can have a world in which humans and AIs can even coexist. But the second reason why it was surprising is that it was literally like a crypto-focused podcast. And so I think that was more surprising almost to me. And like I think at the end when he was asked this question of like, well, is there anything we can do or like people could potentially do? He said something like, if you're that type of person with a strong security mindset that like encrypts their password several times over, is still not happy, then maybe, just maybe, you could take your head at like something like AI safety. And so I think maybe tackling the first kind of surprising fact here first is like, he is really pretty worried about that we're kind of like getting to something like an AGI singleton. And many people have many different definitions of this, but if an AI singleton, we just define here as like an AGI that displaces human civilization as the overall framework of relevance for intelligence and dominates the world, I think that is definitely a world that some people are worried that we're heading towards. But I think that, given existing tools that many of you are working on, we can also work towards maybe something like a civilizational superintelligence, where you have humans and AIs that securely cooperate to compose their local knowledge into the collective superintelligence of civilization. And so that is kind of like I guess a bit of a rephrasing, and many of you are working on individual aspects of this. But I think it's interesting because I think the security and cryptography communities have been working on like secure cooperation across different entities for a long, long time. And so I think it really warrants the question of like, can they contribute anything to the problems within AI safety? And so I just want to breeze through a few interesting examples or like parallels between the spaces that I see, just to kind of like open up people's perspective. And then we hear a lot more like perhaps really more guided presentations afterwards. But how can security and these communities possibly help make AI safe? Well, we have like really, I think, already pretty worrying dynamics of like potentially AI like worsening the computer security offense-defense balance on the short run at least. Like you have things like, like on the dark web already like people use ChatGPT that may allow like script kiddies to get much faster up to speed and like do like almost like no code exploits, and they're already like out there. And I think that's maybe still a little bit more benign. But with zero-day exploits markets being a thing that also like nation states can access and really leverage, I think there is a lot of like security risk that is just kind of like emerging. Then there was a recent really interesting podcast where Carl Schurman went on a Lunar Society podcast, and he really laid out specific scenarios in which AI systems that are like just much more advanced can really like lead to like pretty terrifying cyber attacks. And bioattacks as well, including like the AI systems themselves exploiting vulnerabilities. And so I think there's really like I think a pretty strong argument just for security in general to have to get an update. Now, there's the security mindset that I think I already mentioned, but like Bruce Schneier, who I think many of you probably know, he wrote the leading textbook on cryptography, and he basically said, good engineering involves thinking about how things can be made to work. The security mindset involves thinking about how things can be made to fail. And there's actually a lot of like parallel between that and like thinking about like AI safety, I think. Now, another like interesting, I think, like parallels are like red teaming. And so Paul Cristiano already in 2016, so quite some time ago, like pointed out like the use of red teams. And really like, he actually said, like, I currently believe this is the most realistic long-term approach to building highly reliable systems. And now red teaming is also something that's already used by like OpenAI, many other actors in the space. But I think red teaming is also something that like the security communities know really well, right? Like you have a ton of like bug bounties out there, and you have a ton of like incentives to like really expose certain vulnerabilities early to these companies. So again, I think really interesting parallels. Then you have like the whole notion of AI alignment and principal agent alignment. And so I think there's a really interesting parallels between how people in the principal agent community, and especially also in the computer security community, think about like aligning systems and making them secure. So this is basically more of an ecosystem approach where you think about an entire ecosystem and the human-to-human interactions that are in there, the human-to-object or like computer-object interactions, and the object-to-object interactions that are in there. And you have different kind of like strategies across these different columns for making individual like systems safe in an ecosystem. And so I think, again, there's a lot of like just, I think, an interesting like broader security approach that could be relevant for AI as well. I think a really, really interesting paper, and I'm hoping that we'll discuss this a little bit in more depth later, is the constitutional AI work from Anthropic. And I think this is actually like an earlier paper that they wrote on this. But it's basically like, really training an AI system to supervise another by giving it like principles. So like, a little bit like mirroring how the Constitution works. And I think it's interesting because the Constitution is also often used as a framework, or at least as a pinpointer for many people in the security and cryptography environments, right? You have, for example, in security, POLA, like principle of least authority, that basically mirrors that like you should only really be giving a system access to as little information as possible for it to be able to do their job. And that is also pretty mirroring many of the things that the Constitution, I think, is doing for us on a more legal basis. And so I think, again, there's like some interesting, I think, at least like frameworks of mind that people share. Now there's one on boundary-based security, and we have someone here who's really into this over there. And so Andrew Critch wrote this really wonderful boundary sequence, basically on less wrong, on like how boundaries are something that is pretty universal across agents, and how we cooperate across them, and how that could potentially lead to like universal Schelling points of cooperation across very different entities, some even removed from us in space and time. And I think that particular approach to kind of like safety and security is really similar to the object capabilities approach to security, where it's also a lot about like individual computer objects cooperating with each other using these nested boundaries and challenges and channels. So again, there's a lot of kind of like, at least like, like parallels between the thinking. Now that's for security, just like putting a few examples out there. Now for cryptography, I think there's also a few really, really interesting examples. So one of them is, for example, this is a paper from Georges Cases. He is a Foresight Fellow alum now, and I think is, where are you, Dimitri? Dimitri's supervisor now. And he wrote this really wonderful paper on private machine learning to collaborate on sensitive data. So I think one thing that's interesting about more of the cryptographic frameworks is that, especially for areas where you have sensitive information like finance and healthcare, there are actually specific like cryptographic approaches to machine learning that are perhaps the only game in town to actually make use of this data, because otherwise you have very hard privacy constraints in place. And so again, I think here cryptography can at least help us potentially make a sense of more data than we are otherwise be able to access. But I think that's just one. There's another interesting one, and again, this is perhaps like more of a like stretch of the imagination, but safety via debate is, I think, a really wonderful like approach to AI safety, where basically you have like two different agents debating what an image entails, or like potentially even like what a situation is, and then you have a human in the loop that decides who's right. And so the idea is that you can outsource some of that like very difficult kind of like evaluation of AI systems with a human in the loop, This is, again, like a pretty old paper, and there has been some, I think, really interesting work since that I'm hoping that other people can fill us in on more. But I think it's interesting because I think Richard Ano, who also I think just popped in here, pointed out in a podcast that it's actually pretty difficult to determine that even maybe like that the two AI systems themselves are not colluding against the human. So it could still be that like both of them are arguing, you pick one of them, but at the end of the day, it's very difficult, I think, to determine whether like one of them is actually like really on board with what you're trying to do. And I think, the collusion problem is a general problem in multi-agent system, and especially as AI gets more, I think, like advanced, we will have to kind of really face up to that much more. But it's interesting because avoiding collusion is also something that crypto knows well. And here I also, think of crypto as like Web3 in the sense that like you have things like the Sybil attack, that are pretty dangerous attacks in like cryptographic systems where like, you have like one agent like representing themselves as being many. And again here, like crypto, I think is looking at like various different strategies for being able to at least make collusion less likely. So I think there's again, at least a few kind of interesting parallels that one could draw. Now this was also again, pretty old paper, but from Andrew Trask at OpenMind, he wrote this really wonderful paper on building safe AI, where it is not only that you have basically, it's like if different actors could cooperate on encrypted information using an encrypted machine learning algorithm, it's not only that perhaps you get a little bit more cooperation rather than like competition between these actors, but by encrypting the algorithm itself, you also maybe ending up with something like a kind of like encrypted boxed AI, where you as the private key holder can kind of like determine what information you want to reveal or not want to reveal to the AI systems that's computing on real world data. And so again, that's just a few like kind of like inspirations that I thought were pretty interesting. Now, two more, which are more in the governance space. This is a paper that was published by Ben Garfinkel. He wrote it a while ago, but it was just published, I think, last year. From GovAI, and it's basically he goes through the entire history of cryptography in a really wonderful way, and kind of sees how these tools can apply to different governance scenarios, especially also governance like related to AI, and like actually has like a few very interesting kind of like different ideas here. But like he really goes through, could even like nation states that are like trying to credibly signal or like credibly commit that they're not producing a certain capability in X amount of time, could they be using cryptographic systems to do so? And so I really encourage you, it's a long paper, but it's really, really, really good. And then finally, Gillian Hatfield wrote this paper on regulatory markets, basically like making the case that if you wanted AI regulation, probably the best way to do that is not like one nation state, because it's pretty difficult to keep up with all the kind of like advances in real time. But it could be more like a regulatory market system by which like different entities kind of like regulate each other in this more checks and balances system. And there was a paper that recently came out by Emma Blümke, Teddy, Ben, and Andrew, that basically applied cryptographic protocols for being able, for allowing those markets potentially to exist, and for for different entities to kind of like verify the AI algorithms that like other people are building with. And I think it was interesting because it allows a more flexible approach to things that are usually, I think, pretty difficult to even like regulate or make sense of. Anyway, those are just a few examples. If you want to know more about any of this, we discuss a few more in the book. The physical book is almost pretty outdated at this point, even though it was published, I think, early last year. But there is a Substack version that's free online, and we try to keep that up to date. And then I wrote a longer, less long sequence on like just going into a few of these examples in more depth. But I think that really brought us to kind of like focus a little bit more about this. And so that was our workshop in 2022 that I just discussed. And a few interesting projects came out of that. A few of them are here. And one thing that we launched back then is the Norm Hardy Prize. And so thanks to Agoric and Protocol Labs that put money towards this and sponsored this prize. It's a prize that honors Norm Hardy, who is he's now of late a computer security specialist, and it is mostly trying to build more usable security systems. And so if any one of you is working on that, that may be an interesting prize for you to consider applying to. But that was like one kind of like specific outcome from last year's workshop. And then a few other projects, some of them will also be presenting today. But I think this is just to kind of like maybe lift your minds as to like what could we be doing throughout the next, throughout today and tomorrow, and to perhaps give you a little bit of an idea of like how the workshop will run. So we have the introductions we already had. We're currently in workshop goals. What we're going to do in a second is we're going to have 3 rounds of very brief lightning presentations. And I'll be very, very, very German with my timekeeping because the lightning presentations are not for you to tell everyone about like everything you're working on, but it is mostly just to kind of pin people to specific areas that they could be focusing on afterwards in working groups. And so we'll have like 3 rounds of these lightning presentations, divided by different breaks. And then we have a working group formation session. And this is really where you get together based on a few like topics that will pop out of these presentations, and where you can kind of like self-select into groups to kind of like work on specific problems that you think are most interesting with the people that are here. And I'll say a little bit more about how we do that. There's like an algorithm for that. But it's usually, it usually works pretty well. People can self-select, and that's where you can really deep dive into these issues. We'll then have dinner. We have like breakout drinks for those who want to stick around. And then tomorrow we'll really be mostly focusing in these working groups on like actually figuring out how we can make progress on these specific areas. And again, there's like a prompts and templates for this, and I'll say more about that later. But between 1 and 3, we're going to have working group presentations. So whatever you guys kind of figure out in your individual workshop working groups, you will then be able to present to the group. And the idea here really is to come up with projects that you, either in the form of like a project leader or advisor, or maybe someone who could be interested in this, would actually be interested to push forward after this workshop. And in order to do this, the last thing perhaps I'll say on this is that we recently got funding to launch an AI safety grant program, and that is in 3 specific areas. And so the first of these areas that we're able to fund is neurotechnology, whole brain emulations, and lo-fi approaches for uploading for AI safety. And we just had a big workshop on this. The second one that's probably more relevant here is security, cryptography, and auxiliary approaches for InfoSec and AI security. And so if things come out of this workshop really that fit that bill, then we are interested in funding them. And so if you know people that are like interested in really pushing this project forward, I really welcome you guys to take this as an opportunity to actually perhaps generate a new project with others. And the last area that we'll be funding is safe and beneficial multipolar AI scenarios, which I think again has a lot of overlap with more the security and cryptography oriented approaches to AI. And so this is mostly to kind of lift your gaze and encourage you to take this seriously, the working groups, and to really try to come up with things that you could be interested in working on, or at least could be interested in advising. And so I think in terms of workshop goals, if, for example, you think that a lowest hanging fruit from this workshop at the end of the workshop is really just trying to figure out, you made a new connection, you have a new collaborator, someone that you really want to collaborate with from this long, long list of participants. If the second one is something like you have a new idea for something that could actually influence your workshop, your work in a useful way, I think that's the kind of second, the middle hanging fruit. And then the highest hanging fruit is, I think, really coming up with a project that you could be interested in participating and you could be interested in driving forward if funding is available. And so we're really hoping that we can get there. And in the last workshops, we actually did get there. So I have high hopes for you guys. So I think that's just to provide you with a little bit of context on how the workshop will be unfolding. I do want to say that we will be recording the lightning talks, but then afterwards the group work will all be off the record. And we will be recording the presentation report outs. But I should say, if at any point you don't want to be recorded, just tell us, and then we won't. Also, none of the recordings will see the light of day before we check with you guys prior to that. And we sometimes do very elaborate edits if people share data that they weren't yet supposed to share, or whatever it may be. And then for the actual working groups and for the kind of more discussion parts, it will be Chatham House rule. And so, you are allowed to talk about ideas at this workshop, but don't attribute them to anyone without asking for their permission first. And so that's mostly because, you all operate in pretty technical and pretty niche areas. And so I think it's mostly really to kind of encourage you to think broadly, call each other out when someone makes a mistake, but also do so like jovially, and really like, you know, speak your mind. You know, I think that is definitely like something that we're really trying to facilitate at this workshop. Okay, wonderful. Well, are there any questions for now? No? Okay, well then maybe we can kickstart with the first presentation. So we have now arrived in the first presentation slot. And Philippe, if you want to go up on stage, that would be wonderful.